Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are having a meta conversation about the stories we tell of nature. And the focus is on one particular natural feature that we've dealt with on the program in the past, which is the Grand Canyon in the southwestern United States. Because there's a lot of stories that go into that place. And what's really interesting is that it serves as this collision point for both ecological stories and stories of industrial engineering triumph, because you have a dam system there that's responsible for essentially powering cities that shouldn't exist out there in the desert. San Diego, Tucson, Phoenix couldn't exist without the power grid supplied by this river.
And the water.
And the water. But in the course of doing that, building all of that infrastructure, something changed radically about the natural landscape.
And so for this conversation, we have with us author Kevin Fedarko, who came to my attention when my sister actually recommended his most recent book called A Walk in the Park, where Kevin and his colleague Peter McBride go on assignment for National Geographic to walk the length of the Grand Canyon for the 100th year anniversary of the National Park Service. And so their initial idea is that they're just going to kind of load their backpacks up and figure out how to do this, which is on its surface an absurd goal because there's no trail. So the Grand Canyon is 277 miles long, and there's no trail that runs the length of it. You can walk from north to south, but there's nothing that transects it. And they very quickly discovered that this is an absolutely I think that Kevin has described it as a boneheaded move, or something akin to that, because they're completely unprepared. They've never really intensely backpacked before. They've certainly never backpacked in the desert. They're carrying tons of equipment. They're not properly prepared, and they run.
There's no water.
Yeah, because you're up on the rim. So the goal of this hike is to actually be able to walk not at river level, you're up on the ledges. And so you're constantly having to navigate this landscape that has ephemeral water sources and rocky, loose terrain. You're on narrow ledges 1,000 feet above the river. You don't necessarily know where you're going because technically you have a map, but reality has a way of screwing with you, even when you have a map. And it tells the story of a place that is massive in our imagination, whether you're interested in the geology and the science of it, or you're passionate about wilderness, that requires us to see the place in a new light.
There's also this parallel story too, right? Because we start with his first book, and you have a project of constructing these dams that's on par with the Great Pyramids. Like, it's an enormous effort that has, up to that point, not really been introduced since antiquity. It's an incredible engineering feat. And so that first book deals in some large part with the history of overcoming these various challenges and flooding events that were unanticipated by the engineers. And so you see both sides of this story, right? That's what's really interesting here, is the intersection and the way that we can, and I think this is something we spend a great deal of time discussing in the podcast today, is how you can look at something from two totally different angles and tell very different stories about what's happened here, what it means. And that's what we do on this show, basically, with science or with philosophy, with thought, with the natural world in general. And
Absolutely.
We're definitely dealing with the natural world today.
And there's something that's really interesting about Kevin's work, which is that oftentimes environmentalist stories are morality tales. They're like, this is what's precious, this must be preserved, and at all costs, everybody who threatens it is dangerous and downright evil. And as Kevin's writing his first book, which is called The Emerald Mile, he comes to realize that the morality tale is not the most interesting version of events here. It's actually this larger story about the massive accomplishments of modern civilization cast against the desires of those who wish to experience truly wild places. And he writes so evocatively. He's obviously in love with the Grand Canyon, but he's also in love with all of the people that populate it on both sides of these challenging features. And so it's just one of both books, The Emerald Mile and A Walk in the Park, are magnificent examples of what it means to look at a complicated landscape and trying to figure out how to carve a trail in modernity that doesn't steal something from us and allows us to still progress and exist and build and live.
Multiple layers of metaphor here. I think you have to really open your mind up to the parallels between all of these different fields as you go through this conversation. Remember, guys, if you're enjoying these conversations, our podcast is entirely listener supported. So please come over to patreon.com, check it out, see what's going on there, see if you can give the tiniest piece of your paycheck or a huge fistful of dollars. Either way, it's going to make sure that we can continue to put more and more effort into this project and keep bringing you good stuff. And there's all sorts of ways you can support the podcast besides Patreon. I invite you there first because we have a community going. We get together once a week, and that's really cool. And I'd love to see you there. But you can also just share the podcast with somebody, rate and review it. Make sure to like and subscribe. Come over and talk to us at Discord or Facebook. Share your ideas. These are all equally meaningful ways you can contribute. And of course, huge shout out and thank you to our patrons. We love you guys, and we are completely touched that you're willing to put your money where your ears are.
Thank you.
So with that, enjoy the conversation today, and hopefully I will see you over at Patreon.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see in the dark.
You have a beautifully written book, by the way. I have to say it's really engaging. But a lot of people, we see this in music and we see it in science too, where they think, okay, if I have this really good work or this really good idea, the whole world is just going to drop what it's doing and come, to my feet. And it's easy to think that because we see all of our heroes in literature and art and science, and they do have brilliant ideas, and you're like, wow, that must be what it's all about. And to some extent it is, but the fact that you also have to have that rough and ready attitude of like getting after bringing it to people and being like, oh, no, look at this, just look at it. That's a huge component of success from what I can tell from the like tiny pieces that I've tasted in my own life. It's all about just the grind, really. Of course you have to start with something incredible. That's just a given. But so many people, they make something incredible and then they just turn into bitter assholes because nobody cares. And they're like, well, if they don't care, I'm not going to do anything about it.
Like, it seems like the next step after creating something fantastic is to then figure out how to become also beloved.
Yeah, that's a great word. I remember when I was writing The Emerald Mile, at one point I asked myself what my goals were for the book. And it wasn't I was honest enough to admit that I would have loved to have written like a bestseller, or a book that got me on like an interview with Terry Gross and Fresh Air or something like that. But what I really wanted in the end, I had to admit, was I wanted a book that was adopted by the subculture that I was writing about and profiling. This community of river guides, men and women who became obsessed with the Colorado River inside of Grand Canyon. And I wanted the book to be beloved within that community. And the weird thing is that at a certain point along the arc of this process that I'm kind of talking about right now, just going out and, selling the book. And by the way, I agree with you. I think that actually many creative people, you're right. I think many of us have this idea in our heads that if we create something so gorgeous, the world will just come to it. Our job is to put it into the world. It's the world's job to figure out its brilliance and celebrate its brilliance. And I couldn't have told you this, 10 years ago when I was finishing The Emerald Mile, but like there's something incredibly arrogant about that. Like that is so unrealistic because the world, among many other things, the world is besieged by all kinds of things clamoring for its attention. And I think in some ways that we do a certain injustice to the process that follows putting a creative thing into the world by just saying that it's salesmanship. Because I think it's a lot more than that. I think yes, it is commercial. Yes, there's a mercenary aspect to it. You're trying to get people to buy something. But, you're also learning about how to share the value of what it is and how to tell its story to other people so that in the case of somebody who writes books, they can then open themselves to what the actual story is. And um, I, I think maybe that I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now. I've never really articulated this before, but I think maybe that I don't think of myself as an artist. I think of myself as a craft person,
Hmm.
right? What I do is not art. It's a lot more like plumbing or carpentry, which are endeavors
There's
that
some
have.
art in there though, whether you meant for it to be there or not. In the sense that it does shape the way that we see the world. Like if you see the world differently after an experience that someone's produced, I think it's hard to not call it art. But I understand what you're saying. Like you whittle away at this thing.
I appreciate you saying that, and maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. I almost feel like that's not for me to say. That's for others to say.
I got you.
All I can say about it is that much like plumbing or carpentry, like it's a deeply honorable craft that involves working with humble materials and apprenticing oneself over a long period of time and mastering a set of techniques and applying oneself to a discipline. That's the aspect of it that I'm talking about. And I think that maybe an important part of the process of becoming a person who puts those kinds of objects and things into the world is the part of the process that happens after what most of us think of as the end of the process. Like when I finished the Emerald Mile, I was like, "Oh, I'm done," like that was it. It's now like they printed these books and they're going to go out into the world, and I need to move on to the next thing. And the way I describe it now is that this reversal happened. And I had no idea, no knowledge of this, but like up to the moment when a book is published, I don't know if this is the case with a song or a record, but up to the moment when a book is published, the author of the book is like the engine pulling, and the book is the train, and you are the engine. You build the train behind you, and then you pull it down the tracks, and you make decisions about what set of tracks you're going to shunt onto, and where you're going to take that train, and where you're going to deliver the goods. The moment a book is published, the book becomes the locomotive, and you become the caboose, and the book begins pulling you into places that it wants to go. I don't mean to be too woo-woo about this, but I mean, what starts happening if you have a book that develops an interest in the world, people start calling you up and saying, "Hey, would you mind coming to speak at this particular event?" Or, "Hey, we've decided that our school district is going to adopt your book as the key learning tool for the next 2 years at the high school level. And the English department, the English teachers, and the geography teachers and the science teachers are going to use it, but they're going to use it in different ways. And would you come and speak to our students about how you wrote this thing?" Right? Like that's an experience that is going to bring with it a whole host of insights, and it's going to enrich you in a whole bunch of different ways, but you never could have anticipated it. And that's something that the book pulled you into. You didn't decide to go there. So I feel
That's
like
like an
I'm drumming
incredible
on a
best
bit.
case scenario, I think, for any work of art.
For the work of art to pull you into new experiences.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Hmm.
to some extent, I think a real music's been at the self-publishing for a lot longer, I think, than the book industry, just
Hmm.
because the CD, like digital media, essentially happened. Napster, MP3s, that kind of killed off the record industry very early on in the days of the
Hmm.
internet, and so people have been more on. I think the bands that I interact with and so forth, they really understand that they have to be out there making their own way and pushing their own products, selling merchandise, selling, vinyl, and that's the only way. There's no help from the record company. There's no chance that
Mm-mm.
that's going to do its own work in that same way. But yeah, if you're lucky, then maybe it finds its home in a movie, or it finds its home somewhere else, and then all of a sudden you're being dragged through all of these other different experiences that you could have never imagined. Yeah.
Well, ultimately, when you make a work that is creative, the hope is that it's meaningful enough to someone else that they will pull on it. And I think that that's what's so interesting about your books is that, so we've been reading, I don't know, are you familiar with David Graeber?
No, I don't think so.
He's like, he died a couple years ago. He was an anthropologist, sociologist, and he wrote a lot about the formation of societies, the role of debt in society. And he wrote this book that we've been working our way through and doing discussions of called The Utopia of Rules,
Okay.
where he talks about how modern life has been taken over massively by these bureaucratic ways of thinking, where it started in the 1970s. And he has this funny chart right at the beginning of the book where he's like, so in the 1970s, if you look at Google Ngram, you see that the words for paperwork and performance review just start to spike massively. And then in the early 2000s, they start to decrease. And he's like, I think that the reason that that happened is that these things have now become so entrained in the way that we live our lives that we don't even notice them anymore. Like, we don't necessarily directly reference them. They're just somewhere in the background. It's taken as a given. Nobody's even talking about it. And so he wrote this book to try to figure out how to talk about the bureaucratic capture of all of our lives. And I think that the reason that it's such a meaningful book is because it's trying to talk about something that's really important to people, but they don't have the words for it yet. And I feel like that's what your books do too, which is that there is this interplay between the people and the wilderness and progress and recreation. So I've always thought recreation is a really silly word.
But in a sense, I think what you're saying is it opens up a discussion that wasn't there before, perhaps, or wasn't available to people.
It puts a frame on the discussion in a way that's very cohesive and historical. And there's like so the reason that I think that recreation is a silly word is because it's just like the Bureau of, the like Department of Recreation or whatever, just seems like such a
Rec center.
bureaucratic, like the recreation center. But the original root of the word is to find solace for the mind and spirit.
It's like a rebirth.
Right.
It means rebirth, essentially.
Yeah, and so it's like I think that the role of wilderness in being able to provide that for us, and what it means when we lose that wilderness, and what it means to actually have this massive river that is at the heart of everything, is such a valuable frame for people to be able to talk about it, because I feel like, unlike a lot of authors that write about environmental conditions, you're really like, you're reverent for the technological way in which the river has been harnessed. And so it seems like you carry within yourself these two opposing perspectives, and you don't come down on one or the other of like, no, it should be like completely wild, rip out all the dams, restore it to how it was. But you're like, God, isn't it crazy that this Colorado River is the fulcrum point for all of these things? And that's what makes it so meaningful for people, I think, because there's not another piece of work that does it for a river that is so central to the lives of millions and millions of people.
I mean, thank you for saying that, but I have to say, I can't like to accept the compliment without also saying that, like, I what you just sketched out is a place that I had to get to. I didn't start out intending to write the book in that manner. In fact, I started out intending to do the opposite of that. And the book itself changed the way I thought about these issues. I'm just remembering when early on in the process of writing The Emerald Mile. So this goes back like 20 years at this point, right? I was fortunate enough to wind up in the hands of an editor, a truly masterful editor. So the person who's written both of my books on Grand Canyon is an editor by the name of Colin Harrison. He works at Scribner. He lives in New York City. he's a little bit unusual in the sense that not only is he an author, or not only is he an editor, but he's an author in his own right. So and for a certain period of each and every year, he goes off to Montreal and rents a hotel room and sits for a month and writes his own books. And that has given him an understanding of the process of writing from both sides of the fence. And one of the things that he said to me very early on in the process of writing the Emerald Mile, I'm not going to be able to recall his exact words, but so I'm going to paraphrase here for a bit. But he said something. I think I was asking him, like, what's the right way to write this book, or what's the right way to structure this book? And he's like, he basically said, look, you need to understand something fundamental about this process. The reason that there is no set or right way to write this book or any book is because the right way there is a way that this story needs to be told. And the most important moment for your relationship with the book that you are about to start writing is the moment where you set aside your convictions about how this book should be written, and you begin to allow the book and the story to teach you about how it wants and needs to be written. And and I was like, what the hell does that mean? Like that just sounds like some sort of like Buddhistic, like Zen master koan that, just makes no sense. So I kind of I remember nodding and thinking, all right, fine. I'll maybe try and remember this. And at some point, maybe it'll mean something. But right now, that doesn't really help me at all. So the book that I thought I was writing, as I mentioned a moment ago, like this is a book that it's a portrayal of a subculture that I very much wanted to become a part of. I was transfixed by these little wooden boats called whitewater dories. I wanted them to take me into this landscape that I had been intrigued by since childhood, but had never seen with my own eyes until I was in my mid-30s. And I wanted to become a Grand Canyon dory guide, in the midst of what felt at the time like a failed career as a magazine writer. And I discovered over the course of the first season down there as an apprentice river guide that I sucked at, rowing and reading whitewater. But I did discover a story that I thought could become a book. And because I was surrounded by and introduced to the river and the canyon by river guides, I saw the landscape and the history of that place through the lens of those people, right? They were the prism through which I looked at and interpreted everything. And there are very few river guides who are not kind of like fierce environmentalists who view the structure of the Glen Canyon Dam and the organization that built that giant hydroelectric dam, and not just that dam, but all the other dams and the irrigation networks, all of the infrastructure that we have used to harness the greatest river in the Southwest. River guides view all of that as an act of evil that was perpetrated against this magnificent free-flowing river that symbolized the beauty and the freedom of untrammeled nature. They view the Glen Canyon Dam as a crime that was committed against the river, and the men, they were almost all men, the men who designed and built and managed that structure, as villains. And so I discovered this story about the Grand Canyon involving these three river guides, and they're going to harness a historic flood that is imperiling this giant hydroelectric dam. And I viewed it as kind of a morality tale. It's going to be like, oh, this is a story about these three river guides riding the ancestral fury of this river that is not just testing, but overcoming the shackles that have been that in which it's been placed by these hydroelectric engineers, and affirming the power of nature. And like that's what I thought I was writing. And the problem with nonfiction writing is that at a certain point, you need to make contact with and speak to the people that you're writing about. And so I got to a certain point in the research process where I had to figure out, well, who were the men who were in charge of Grand Canyon Dam during the Spillway Crisis in 1983? Who were they? And what do they have to say about all this? And I eventually tracked down the guy who was in charge of the whole dam, the operations manager. And I reached out. It was a difficult process to find him. I finally found him, and I said, I'm so glad to have found you, and I can't wait to come out to California and have a conversation with you. And he's like, well, tell me a little bit about your book. And so I started talking about the book, and he cut me off and he said, you know what? I have no interest in speaking to you. It's very clear to me what you're doing. And I have no interest in serving as fodder for the kind of piece of environmental propaganda that you're about to write. So good luck with your book and goodbye. And at that point, I had to sort of take a step back and take a look at what I had said to this man, and then take a look at what I thought I was doing with the book. And I ended up sitting down and writing him a letter. And I basically said, look, I realized that I probably created a certain impression, which is true in your mind about how I've been approaching this story. But what's more important to me than writing this story the way that I think I see it is to actually talk to and learn from as many people as I can. So if I were to tell you that I'm opening my mind to new ways of interpreting the story of the flood of 1983, would you be willing to speak with me? And he wrote back and said, yep, come on out. And I arrived at his house, and he had all this material spread out on his dining room table, and he was prepared to talk about the Spillway Crisis and the dam. But we sat down in his dining room, and he started talking about his wife who had just died recently, and he burst into tears. And so in an incredibly long-winded way, what I'm talking about here is that I had to reframe how I understood some of the main characters in the book that I was writing, and see them both as villains through the eyes of a certain set of characters, but influenced by my own perception. Because when I came away from my encounter with this man and then the other men that I met through him, I liked a lot of these guys. I really did. And I liked the fact that I respected the fact that even though I did not share the same values that they do with respect to the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon, nature, industrialized forms of energy, I really did respect their integrity as professionals, as engineers. They stopped a runaway river in June of 1983 and basically saved a 710-foot tall wall of concrete
With plywood.
With freaking plywood. And in so doing, like there's a lot of environmentalists who are like, look what they did, how stupid this is. It just proves that the dam was a dumb idea in the first place. And I mean, how incompetent do you have to be to build a dam that has to be fixed with plywood? But if you're an engineer, and this is what these guys taught me, like, you know that the best solution is not the most elegant solution or the solution that covers up the fact that there was a problem in the first place. It's the simplest and cheapest thing that solves the crisis for the moment, that then allows you to go back and address the problem at a deeper level. And I came away from all of this with a respect for their point of view without necessarily sharing their values. And out of that arose a conviction that the story that it was my job to write was not a morality tale. It was a story that laid out this complex set of events that occurred in the spring of 1983 at this magnificent and iconic piece of technology. And the parallel set of events that happened in Grand Canyon on the river below the dam as a result of the crisis at the spillways of the Glen Canyon Dam, and that all of it was this incredible story, and that my job was to lay it out so that people could decide for themselves, to lay it out as objectively as I could, while also not holding back on my own passion for and feelings about the beauty of the Grand Canyon, the setting in which all of this took place. And
can you give people a little bit of background on what actually happened there, just for people who might not be aware
about
this?
What happened in 1983?
Yep.
So what we're talking about a set of events that began unfolding actually earlier in the year, when what was at the time the largest El Nino event on record. There have since been greater El Ninos that have occurred, but in 1983, nobody had seen an El Nino event of the magnitude of the one that began to unfold all the way on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. A set of meteorologic changes that triggered a whole set of events, including a massive phalanx of storms that moved across the Pacific Ocean and began striking the west coast of the United States, and then making their way above the Intermountain West and hitting the Rocky Mountains in the winter and spring of that year. And among many, many other things, laying down a snowpack of such epic proportions that it hadn't been witnessed in more than 2 generations. And all of that snow in the southern Rockies at a point in late May, when the temperatures abruptly shot into the high 80s, began to come down out of those mountains in one vast, huge, wet rush. And that snowmelt moved out of the Rockies and across the Colorado Piedmont and into the Badlands of southeastern Utah, and it all wound up in the same place, the upper end of this enormous reservoir called Lake Powell, which stretches 186 miles upstream from the Glen Canyon Dam. It's the longest reservoir in the United States. And as the water poured into the lake, into the reservoir, the surface of the reservoir began climbing the walls of the Glen Canyon Dam and approaching the parapets of the dam. And then the process created a crisis. There are a number of tubes inside the dam that are designed to direct water through the turbines, through the penstocks and the turbines and the generators, and you take the kinetic energy of the river and transform it into electricity. But there's also an insurance policy. There are these 2 enormous tunnels that have been carved into the sandstone on either side of the dam, known as spillways. And in the event of a massive flood, you're supposed to be able to open these spillways and start to lower the level of the reservoir. And they can put, in theory, a lot more water through those spillways than they can through the penstocks of the dam. Problem is that they've never been tested under emergency conditions. A series of events began unfolding inside the spillway tunnels. The tunnels began to collapse. There's a complex process known as cavitation that's probably not worth going into too deeply right now. But the result is that the managers of the dam were forced to make a series of decisions between some really bad options: shutting down the spillways entirely and allowing the reservoir to continue climbing toward the parapet of the dam and the gates of the spillways, which would have created a set of disastrous events, or opening one or both spillways and letting water move through, but damaging the tunnels even further, potentially threatening the integrity of the dam itself by losing control of the river, and creating a massive flood inside the Grand Canyon that resulted in hydraulic features that had either never been witnessed or hadn't been seen in many, many years by river guides inside of the canyon. So all of that is, in a nutshell, what's known as the Spillway Crisis of 1983, triggered by this massive El Nino event. And so the engineers at the Glen Canyon Dam were the people who were responsible for basically figuring out how to save this dam. And as I began speaking to these men and realizing that I liked them and they changed the way that I saw the story. They didn't bring me over to their point of view and convince me that like building the Glen Canyon Dam and harnessing the Colorado River and using its water to build giant cities like Phoenix and Tucson and San Diego that are fundamentally unsustainable within the desert environment of the American Southwest, that any of that was a good idea. But I still felt like they were good people and they had a sense of integrity about their jobs and they had a deep sense of pride. Stopping a runaway river in June of 1983 was the culminating event in their careers. And they did not look upon that as with shame. They looked upon it with pride. And so the story that I set out eventually to tell was to basically try and honor everyone's story and everyone's perspective. The river guides who viewed the dam as an act of evil, and the engineers who felt that like this is one of the best things that had ever been created. And to talk, I realized at a certain point to talk not about who was right and who was wrong, but about the manner in which the canyon itself offers a collision point between these two cultures and all of the impulses that reside at the heart of those two cultures, and what that says about us as a society that on the one hand values and reveres natural beauty to the point where we became the first nation in the world to create national parks, and at the same time, has treated the resources of this continent as like a giant cash register or a grocery store that you get to run into and grab as many things as you can and run out of.
And I feel a lot. I think a lot of us feel this in our personal lives too, because we both love being in pristine nature, but we also can't live without the culture that cities afford us and the interactions that we get as a result of it. I feel completely schizophrenic about this all the time in my own life, and I still don't know the solution really.
About it. I don't know if there is, and if there is, it's for smarter minds than mine to comprehend and articulate. But we all live with those contradictions, but we don't all acknowledge those contradictions. And what a place like Grand Canyon, if you combine the Glen Canyon Dam with the Grand Canyon, what that does is it affords the opportunity to acknowledge and think about and reflect upon and wrestle with those contradictions. So just to tie off the arc of this little story I'm telling, back to my editor, Colin Harris's piece of advice about, you will begin to understand how this book needs to be written when you finally open yourself to the book telling you how the story needs to be told. That's what he was talking about. And I didn't understand any of it until I met with Tom Gamble, the operations manager of Glen Canyon Dam during the Spillway Crisis, and I realized that there was another way of telling this story, and I decided that I was going to move from a morality tale to just a story that allows other people to develop their own opinions about not just the Spillway Crisis, but the landscape itself and the larger conflation of forces that are brought to bear when you have a giant piece of technology juxtaposed against one of the gorgeous natural features on the planet. And that was the lesson that my editor was telling me that the book would impart at a certain point if I kept an open mind.
And
now I'm long-winded enough that I forgot completely what question I was answering.
The meaning of the book, because I was like, look, it's incredible that you managed to write this book that's an environmentalist tale on some level that doesn't drip with contempt for the people that built the dam.
Yeah, a lot of reverence actually for the heroic feats. And it was one of the largest structures ever built at the time, from what I understand. The Grand Coulee surpassed it maybe later.
Grand Coulee surpasses it. Hoover surpasses it in some ways, but there's no question that it's as iconic as any of the other massive hydroelectric dams. And I guess what I was trying to tell you is that, like, I didn't set out to do any of that. If that is perceived as something that the book, something of value that the book has, that wasn't my intention. It was something that the book and the process of writing the book taught me.
But I think that a lesser writer would have not allowed themselves to learn that lesson. Because I think that it's easy when you have a deep investment into pristine nature to close yourself off to that idea. And, I have a deep reverence for wild places that is constant, like Shiloh said, it's very schizophrenic. It comes into constant conflict with also my deep reference for dense, walkable urban city centers where you can get all of the, neat little things that are offered by that kind of place. And so I find myself alienated by a lot of environmentalist writing that doesn't manage to do that, because I think that for any environmentalist story, there is the other sides that can easily be ignored. And the fact that you didn't is what I think makes this Emerald Mile so powerful. And I think that it's a really interesting thread that shows up in the second book, A Walk in the Park, because of what's planned for the confluence.
Mm.
And so
we've like discovered the exact same thing too. We wrote a really dry science book for the first. We wrote like 80,000 words. We were like, okay, it's done, it's great. And like as soon as we started shopping it around, everybody was just like, this is boring. Like this is not. If you want to sell this to an academic press and have 30 people read it, go ahead. But if you want actual people to engage with this, like you need to tell a story that has characters and has drama, and it was really fun to discover all that. We're still discovering it, but we really quickly had to surrender whatever vision we had for exactly how this was supposed to go down and open ourselves up to something completely new. It's kind of turned into a detective story at this point, which is a really long ways away from just a book about atomics.
And how did it feel when you first started hearing that message?
I mean, I guess like just having been in media and art for a long time, I'm pretty open to ideas and criticism and stuff. So I was actually glad to get some feedback, but it did surprise me because I come from a world. I actually personally, when I read books, I read for information most of the time. Like I can read really, really fast because I'm just trying to like grab the pieces that fit into my pre-existing worldview, I guess, or displace it in some way. And so I kind of write like that too. Like I'm just like listing like all the information you'll need to understand this idea. And it's not very interesting to read. So it's been wonderful. Nasi is much more accomplished.
The man has been slow to come around to the value of beautiful prose.
They're just stories, right? Just stories, right? Just telling the human element of any historic venture, right?
It's really funny. He'll like read out loud to me sometimes, and I can tell that he's having to stop himself from like jumping from place to place because I think that you read out loud slower than you read like in your head. And so like when I read something out loud, I can kind of see what's coming. And so I can tell that he's having to stop himself from like jumping forward and actually maintaining the thread of the prose, which has been really interesting to watch.
I love that idea though of just letting the work take you somewhere as you go, and being really opening your heart and mind to what that is. I think that's really valuable advice for any artist or craftsman.
We actually
crafts is sorry, one last anecdote. My dad's a stone carver, and he's been talking about this my whole life, and it never really hit me until later in life. But yeah, you can't just start with this perfect picture because you have to follow the grain, especially with wood, right? You have to really work around the knots and follow the contours, right. And okay, I guess this guy's hand's gonna be up now or whatever it is, because that's what it instructs you to do. And I think that when you approach art or craftsmanship in that way, not only is it more successful, but it's probably more enjoyable too. You can grow and actually get some help from as opposed to resistance from the work itself.
I think that's incredibly well put. And your reference to wood is it turns out my brother, I have a younger brother he's a master cabinet maker. He lives on the coast of Maine. And I'm struck we're now in our late 50s. We're old, and I'm old enough to be able to see not just the differences, but the commonality that unites what we do. And it's pretty clear to me that both he and I are involved as craftspeople in something endeavors that have more in common than one might think. And perhaps the greatest commonality is something you were just alluding to. I mean, to be a master woodworker, to make beautiful furniture out of wood, you are working with a material that is organic and is filled with imperfections. And the beauty of what you create resides in part in your willingness and ability not to resist or cover up those imperfections, but to actually work with them and allow them to take you in directions that you might otherwise not have gone. And in order to do that, you have to be able to pay attention to the material at a granular level. The grain, the cells, the knot. You can take all of that as a metaphor and apply it to language, and stories work exactly the same way, regardless of whether you're working with fiction or nonfiction. It just plays out according to a different set of metrics.
And that's what makes it exciting too, because the unexpected happens organically at that point, right? So when I read or watch a really well-written movie or something, I'm like, oh yeah, I know what's going to happen, and then it doesn't, right? And it's so
like we
brilliant.
watched Malice the other night, which is like a 90s movie. It's Alec Baldwin, Nicole Kidman, and some guy that I don't remember. And I was really kind of bored with it because I was like, I think I can predict how this is going to happen and how it's going to fold out. And at some point, right when I was like, oh, I know how this is going to go, the movie turns completely, and it's just this absolute revelation that you don't expect. And that's what made it fantastic.
It does it again too,
and
right?
it does
There's
it again.
Twists,
It was incredible.
But I
Which
sense
gets us back. That gets us back to Colin Harrison's, like advice to a young writer. It's like there's not a blueprint out there that you can follow. The work itself is what reveals the pathway that you need to take with this particular project, and that pathway will be different from the project that preceded it, and it is different from the project preceding it, will be different from the project that follows. And there's no way of predicting those things. And if you try and engineer it from the front end, you will wind up with something that is not inherently satisfying to a lot of human minds, because, to touch on something that you also mentioned a moment ago, we are consumers and producers of story. Like, there's a bunch of things that characterize us as human beings. The size of our brains, the way that our digits work with opposable thumbs, the fact that, at a certain point we came down from the trees and started walking erect across the savannas of Africa. And another thing that makes us unique in the animal kingdom is that we are drawn to narrative as a way of transmitting and understanding information about the world. We have been telling one another stories since we first started applying different colored materials to the walls of caves. And this is how we pass an understanding of what the world is and how to move through it from a generation that has been given 20 or 30 or 40 years to figure it out to the next generation that just arrived and doesn't know anything. That's a really, really important part of who we are and how we survive, and how we built, for better and for worse, the civilizations that followed from that. Storytelling it's I don't
I
know if
mean, I
it's
think
at the
there's a
base of
case
our
to be
DNA.
made. There's a case to be made that, and it is often made, that the world is not just made out of atoms, but it's really made out of stories too. Like if you just walk down the street, you're like, the only reason any of this works is because people have a story for how it's supposed to work. Everything from, walking into an auditorium and knowing what to do. You don't climb up on stage and sit facing the other way or whatever. Everything you do is based on a shared story that everybody kind of agrees to and gets on board with. I mean, we live in this completely fictitious universe, essentially, that we've constructed. It's incredible, actually.
It is, and I mean, feel free to push back against this, what I'm about to say, if you disagree with it. But one of the reasons that I have so much respect for science people, for people of science, scientists and engineers, is I think they have an ability to um, to push the need for storytelling and entertainment aside, and to do what you do, which is to it's a willingness to extract the poetry and toss it to the side and just focus on the information. And that takes an enormous amount of discipline, um, to be able to say, I'm so fascinated in this particular subject that I'm willing to just take the lecture, the PowerPoint program. And I don't need the poetry and the entertainment and the narrative arc and the storytelling to pull me along, because my fidelity to an obsession with just drawing the information in is so great that I can circumvent what most of the rest of us need. And I think there's something really admirable about that. Um,
I mean,
it's why,
if we wanted to push back, it would be more that the story, you can't get away from the story as a human being, like we set up originally, and so stories do become the fundamental kernel in science as well, and they can be multi-generational stories that sometimes topple over catastrophically at some point in time, right? Because you learn to tell the story and you build your work on top of it. But at the same time, I think that any really good scientist is trying to make up their own story about that. Like they just want I shudder to say the word facts, but they want the information because they don't want to hear the story. They want to assemble it from de novo so that they can spare themselves the catastrophe that inevitably happens, right? In this sort of Kuhnian sense, like this scientific ideas become really popular, then they just start to get these little cracks, just like the dam, right? Little things build up, and at some point the whole thing just busts, or you build a new dam next door, or whatever. There's an alternate solution usually that becomes more favorable.
I've actually been playing a lot with the idea that science is the process of myth making according to a different set of metaphysics.
oh, wow.
Where
Okay.
it's like if you have a myth that is traditional, it's full of these supernatural gods and actors, and things happen without a material cause and effect because the god is angry, and so there's this the emotion is manifest on the world. A storm comes or a flood comes or whatever else. And when science was formulated, it was by virtue of saying, look, we're still looking at what is invisible. Like if you look at science, it's always this task of looking at something that cannot be directly seen and trying to assemble it into a narrative. And so what they said at some point is they were like, okay, so our metaphysics is that we cannot have supernatural actors. We cannot have gods and monsters that live somewhere in the unseen, the homunculus that causes the seed to grow into the human. We must instead focus on, honestly, atoms. Like there have to be atoms that are pushing on each other, and there are bodies that are interacting. And so we still tell myths because they're about what cannot be observed. We've just
Or
agreed
especially the deep past, right? Like archaeology,
Oh, yeah.
things like that, the cosmology, right? You're telling this story where you're weaving together what you can see, but you have to fill it in with all sorts of stuff you can't see.
Like the way that geology worked over the
Yeah.
course of the last few hundred years, right? It's the idea that at first it's this catastrophism that is informed deeply by the way that religions talk about the formation of the world. Then as people start to think more scientifically. They're like, no, it's uniformitarianism. It's only the things that we can see that operate inside of the unseen. And it takes a tremendous amount of effort and at personal cost for somebody like J. Harold Bretz to come around and be like, well, no, I think that the Columbia Gorge and the channeled scablands were the product of a catastrophic event. And then it's this
Right.
entire thing of having to reevaluate, like, what does it mean for us to tell this kind of story about the past as opposed to this,
We're
you
still
know,
very allergic to catastrophism. I feel like
we are,
it's
yeah.
really pisses people off. I think that's the whole Graham Hancock thing and
But I
the
think
Younger
that,
Dryas event and all of that.
but I think that science would actually operate much better if people acknowledged to themselves that what they're telling is stories. They're dry stories, but they are stories. And I don't know that we can get away from that as much as we try. And if we convince ourselves that what we're telling is not story but fact, like we're just speaking the truth of the
That's
the
capital
danger,
T of the
that's the
universe,
danger.
I'm like, whoa, that's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, they're all hypothetical stories.
No, I think you've just convinced me that what I said, this pronouncement I just made, was probably silly and wrong. Because
But I think
you're
it's a
right.
very common one. Like I think that's a lot of people outside of science really see it that way.
Right.
And it's totally understandable. I certainly did before I actually embarked on doing science myself. Yeah, I worry that scientists often get this pass because people think that they're somehow excluded from that myth making project that we all embark on. And
Right.
and
Right.
that can cause problems, obviously.
No, but yeah, but I think you're unquestionably right. I mean, the branch of science I'm most familiar with as a layperson is geology. And what is geology? But it's trying to come up with stories that explain the evidence that you hold in your hand or you see at your feet. And we come up with a story that seems to satisfy the laws of, you know, physics and thermodynamics and whatever else until a better story comes along, until somebody else comes up with a better, more compelling story that it includes more of the anomalies. And yeah, it is storytelling. It is. And the versions of the state of the art, the accepted state of the art in geology, they're the stories that prevailed over the other ones that got cast aside. We find them more compelling because the narratives offer a better explanation. It is storytelling. You're
Or
right.
it's an explanation that we like more. Like one of my favorite cases
Yeah.
of this is in geology, there was a very popular theory that was contemporary with continental drift and plate tectonics, which was expanding Earth. Have you heard of this?
No.
What was the idea? So, like, the idea is that if you take all of
It
the
sounds completely nuts, but there was a moment when it had
Yeah,
equal
yeah.
footing with
Yeah.
what we think of as continental drift, plate tectonics. Go ahead.
And so the idea is that, okay, so if you assemble all of the continents together into the supercontinent of Pangaea, there's this place there that's called the Tethys Sea, which
Yep.
is like between two of the pieces. And then the rest of the planet is just ocean.
Right.
And so there's this knob of continent in a total water world.
They also don't fit together too well.
They don't fit together. There's a lot of gaps in between the continents as you assemble them. But if you were to assemble that same collection of continents on a planet that was, I think, like
70%?
70% of the size, they fit together perfectly and they don't have a Tethys Sea. And, you know, there was the expansionists were making all of these models where they would make the cutouts of the continents and assemble them on smaller globes, and they were able to demonstrate that this is more plausible. There's also the issue that, like, the Tethys Sea is missing. There's no fossil evidence of the Tethys Sea. It's this, they think that it's been subsumed over the course of continental drift. And also that the ocean floors are only 200 million years old. And so the model for continental drift and plate tectonics is that there's this like conveyor belt of subduction at the continental margins.
Yep.
But they were like, you know, that's a hypothetical mechanism. Perhaps that's not possible. Perhaps the Earth grew in size. but they didn't have a mechanism for how it could have grown in size. And the mechanism of mantle convection was much more,
Also not observed, but at least seemed within reach.
like, it was plausible.
But the ideas they had for how the Earth would expand were just crazy at the time.
But what's really interesting is that this theory gets completely dismantled, thrown away, like, obviously no mechanism, how crazy. It's definitely plate tectonics. And now as we start to map the magmatic subsurface, we realize that, like, the neat story of plate tectonics doesn't really work out that well. Because if you look, the ridges at the center of the bottoms of the oceans should be the place where these mantle plumes well up, and then you have the conveyor belts. But as we map the mantle plumes, they don't seem to line up to those margins.
Also, if you look at the drift vectors from the plates, they're crazy. Like they don't seem to be doing anything approximating what they're supposed to be doing. But it's funny because this is so archetypical. Like, you have all of these super popular ideas like plate tectonics or whatever it is. You're like, well, of course that's how it works. Everybody agrees. But when you start really looking at all these things, you're like, this isn't going to be our theory 100 years from now. I don't know what is necessarily, but like every single one of these monumental theories that the public is aware of, they're all broken deeply in some very characteristic way. And it's like, and then your next thought is like, well, of course. Like, how young are we as a civilization? We've been doing science for like 300-400 years. Like, of course we're not going to have everything figured out. But it's funny, that disconnect between, oh, well, there's this agreed upon objective story and the internal landscape of the people dealing with it who are like, wait a second.
Which, to bring it back to the conversation about the dam and the river, is, I think, why the morality play in terms of things that are happening right now is such a flimsy frame for being able to talk about it. Like, morality play works for Aesop's fables, but morality play doesn't work for a story that's still in development, that's still, like, in real time. We don't know what the consequences are. We don't know how to solve it. We don't know how to figure it out. And anything that limits it down, that flattens it to, like, this is the perspective that we have, is going to prevent us from actually being able to do the explorations that are necessary to resolve these massive tensions, whether it's between competing theories or competing groups that have a passion for a wild river versus needing to provide electricity for 30 million people.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I'm being reminded as I listen to both of you that, there's a certain level of discomfort that I have with the certitude of, to study the geology of a place like the Grand Canyon at the surface level, at a layperson's level, is not to familiarize oneself with all the brokenness of theories deeper down, because it's enough for most people like me. It's enough of a cognitive challenge just to get the ideas into the accepted theories into your head and kind of figure them out, and to kind of like load all that information is a pretty significant act for most people, much less to drill beneath the surface of those theories and be like, oh wait, this isn't working at 6 other levels. So for a non-scientist like me, there's a kind of a point of relief that you arrive at when you begin to finally get to the point where you're like, okay, I think I understand this place, right? Like, I can name all the rock layers and understand their ages, and I understand continental drift, and I know that the continents were part of Pangea when the rim of the canyon was formed, and and that certitude is challenged when I encounter something like, here's an example of something that you find in the Grand Canyon. So if you take a commercial river trip to the Grand Canyon, you will have a guide or a set of guides, and hopefully, usually most of those guides will have some knowledge of the geology of the canyon, and they will tell you a story of how it formed. And that story will open your mind to the idea of deep time, deep geologic time. And you will, if you work a little bit at it, you will open a doorway in your mind, and you will move from an understanding of history that goes back hundreds or thousands of years to millions, tens of millions, and even billions of years. But there's a small group of outfitters in the Grand Canyon who run creationist trips. And you can spend 2 weeks going through the canyon, having that same landscape interpreted for you by someone who believes that the earth is 7,000 years old and that all of the rock layers in the canyon offer evidence to support that theory and refute all the other theories. And someone like me has nothing but contempt for that. I mean, I'm offended by it at so many different levels that it would take another podcast to just lay them all out. And yet, when I hear you talk about the brokenness of the theories that are accepted, I'm also forced to contemplate the possibility that, like, maybe these people have something to say. I really don't think they do, because I think that a lot of their theorizing is driven by a wish at the very start of it. You know, the idea that there needs to be coherence, there needs to be a deity at the center that's driving all of this, and everything else is built from that assumption. And I don't think that's a good way of building stories, but nevertheless, you know, and
Well,
they
yeah,
certainly
their
have
alternative kind of sucks, but it's funny that you mentioned those creationists because they're some of the only people who actually have out of the box critiques of standard geology. It's really fun. I mean, I think I've been open to reading those kind of websites for a long time, but because I think I have that whatever disposition to just pick out little pieces of information that I think are interesting and ignore the narrative that's being pushed on me. And I think that's a perfect case where, I mean, there's some, I can't remember the website right now, but there's some geology professor who is a creationist. And he has this huge website that's very well referenced with interesting conundrums, little cracks in the foundations of a lot of geologic theory. And again, I don't think the alternative that they're pushing is particularly salient. I think it's more broken than the cracks that they're pointing out. But it is really interesting that those are the only people that are motivated enough to find problems with the standard geological narrative. Nobody else is working on it because everybody else is inside of some institution that's inherited a set of stories that they inherently have to repair and build upon, right? These institutional stories are the same scale as a dam, right? They're a huge project that involves hundreds of, perhaps thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people across time working on these projects. And so there's something there. I don't know, despite the ridiculous idea that the Earth was made 7,000 years ago, it's like there's tiny little pieces of critique in there that I think are valuable.
I think it's fascinating. It's a little bit disturbing for somebody like me.
Sorry.
But it also speaks to the importance of keeping the doorways of one's mind open rather than closed, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I find it, I used to be disturbed by these kind of things, but I feel like the more that I see us as kind of little babies, like the human project is still very, especially this modern thing that we're building, like we just got the internet. We have basically no idea what we're doing. All this information, we have no idea how to manage it. We've been in this position where we're living in small groups of people with one story for, most of our evolution. I see it as almost like watching like a child make some mistakes or whatever. I'm just kind of like, it's kind of cute. Like we'll figure it out. I don't know. It's more just makes sense to me as par for the course for an organism that's growing and learning about the world and trying to do the best job that it can at any given point in time.
Hey, really quick, do you think that we could take a break? I gotta use
Yeah,
the
yeah.
bathroom. Okay,
Absolutely.
let's do that.
Sorry, pee break.
Pardon the quick interruption. I do have to ask you for a very small favor. If you are enjoying the podcast and you've listened to a couple of episodes and you want to help the podcast out, come over to patreon.com/demystifysci. We really, really want to keep the podcast free of sponsors and advertisers, and in order to do that, make it free for everybody and free from outside influences, we need your help. So come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and join us today.
We could talk a bit about the second book too.
Yeah, so the first book is The Emerald Mile, and it's the story of these Grand Canyon Dory River guides who decide that they're going to take advantage of this historical anomaly where they're going to open the spillways of this really damaged dam, put more water in the river than it's seen since the construction of the dam. And honestly, from the chart in your book, I think it's like for many decades before also.
You know what? That's one important thing that I should emphasize. The dam, the levels of water that were released through the dam in 1983 were larger than any level that had been witnessed since the construction of the dam, roughly 15 to 20 years earlier. But the flood itself, the runoff of that year, it was driven by an unprecedented El Nino event, and it came out of the mountains incredibly fast, and it had a catastrophic effect on this relatively new piece of technology, this giant hydroelectric dam. But those levels, we're talking, 93,000 cubic feet per second flowing through the Grand Canyon at the most intense part of that runoff. Those are by no means unprecedented. It was not. It was normal for the Colorado River, the ancestral pre-dam Colorado River, to witness those levels somewhere between once every 3 and once every 5 years. And that's a characteristic of a natural system unfettered by technology infrastructure, right? These incredible spikes, that just occur, and it's also characteristic of a desert environment like the Southwest, where you have, long periods of relatively static equilibrium, but punctuated by these often incredibly intense and often storm-driven events. And that occurs at the macro level of, the river itself, and it also occurs at the micro level of, individual cloud bursts, microstorm events that create highly localized but extraordinarily violent debris flows in side canyons, tributaries of the main stem Grand Canyon. And this is how the canyon itself is excavated and carved out. It's why it looks the way it does. It's why it is pierced by so many tributaries. Those tributaries are created by relatively small, highly localized storm-driven events that actually occur a lot more frequently than most people who study this sort of thing ever anticipated, until we began setting up cameras inside canyons and realizing how frequent they are. Okay, that's a huge digression, but I apologize for that. But
No, I love
was
that.
Well,
important.
it's really cool because I think most people think about the canyon as being this like slow trickle that carves it over
Right.
millions and millions of years. But it's like, I bet at least around here, the thing that really shapes the rivers is these big events, these huge storms, where you just see something massive change. These boulders get moved around. I'm sure it's the same kind of thing in the canyon.
It is, and it represents, in a way that I find really intellectually satisfying and elegant, um, a marriage of the two the two different what were the two different schools of geologic thought, prior to about 100 years ago. I mean, it combines catastrophism with. Please remind me of what the opposite of catastrophism is.
Uniformitarianism.
Thank you, uniformitarianism, and the idea that the
Which
best
sounds like a
story.
religion.
It does sound like and in some ways it was a religion within certain schools of geologic thought, and it's combining those two stories together that provides the material for the best story that we have right now, which may ultimately not be, a story that prevails over time, but it's borrowing significant elements from both. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this is my understanding of it as a layperson. But the Earth is characterized by long periods of static equilibrium and relative tranquility. But the events that create the landforms that we identify and interpret, significant geomorphologic change happens as a result of catastrophic events. Would you add to or take away from?
No, I think that
I mean,
that's exactly
science hates
right.
the black swan events too, right? We really would love to tell these stories of I think fundamentally, the more we can simplify it and say that things have been going this way and these processes That's a really nice story too, because it tells of a future that's very predictable and easy to get accustomed
Yes.
to. But
Yes.
unfortunately, yeah, I mean, what, there's like a billion years of rock missing from the Grand Canyon too, that people are just like, yeah, like something happened. I don't know.
The Great Unconformity, right? So there's the is the Vishnu schist is overlaid by the Tapete sandstone, and there's this huge amount of rock that's missing, and there's been all of these theories that have tried to explain how it's possible to have layers that are a billion years apart in age directly lying on top of each other, and so it's like snowball Earth and all these things that are proposed as a possible mechanism for its destruction.
Well, although, it's my understanding, and you would want to speak to an actual geologist to confirm this, is that it's not all that inexplicable and it's not all that unusual. I mean, it's called the Great Unconformity because the gap in time is so significant. And you're absolutely right. It's the roughly 600 million-year-old Tapete sandstone sitting, as geologists say, uncomfortably on top of the 1.7 to 1.9 billion year old Vishnu schist and Zoroaster granite. And it's also a layer of sedimentary rock sitting atop rock that is, metamorphic. But those layers, not all of them, but many of those missing layers, you can actually see a bunch of them at various different points in Grand Canyon. It's a subset of the geologic, um, the geologic pageant known as the Grand Canyon Supergroup. And I think the Grand Canyon Supergroup is 5 or 6 layers that were eroded away in most parts of the canyon, but are still extant in others. And further upstream along the Colorado River, some of those layers are intact. I mean, it's not an unusual thing to have a landscape where, the bedrock is metamorphic rock that is comprised of stone originally created by mountain building events, buried deep inside of the earth, cooked into something that changed the molecular alignment and structure of the rock itself, a bunch of sedimentary rock built upon that, and over an enormous period of time, those layers being eroded down, and then a new series of mountain. I mean, if you build continental drift and orogenies, mountain building events into your understanding of that scale of time, to have that amount of rock removed and then replaced by a bunch of other rock, like not that unusual.
It is a
Uh,
really clean cut, though.
It is a really clean cut.
And
Yes,
it's
it
like
is.
it's weird how it is literally. I mean, and obviously it's not uniform where, like you're saying, the supergroup exists elsewhere. It's I think that what it tells us more than anything is just how hard it is to be able to recreate the story of how something like that could happen because it's so deep in the
There's very
past.
few places on Earth where you can even access rock that's at those layers, right? You hear these numbers thrown out all the time about the age of the Earth or the age of the solar system, and they're really basing that on very few samples at the end of the day, which is kind of fascinating. So I think it's just a difficult story to substantiate in any way. I mean, come on, you're talking about things that happened an unimaginable length of time ago, So there's going to be some missing pieces for sure.
Yeah, and I think maybe for all those reasons and a host of others, like I think the Great Unconformity, um, it represents a really fascinating and provocative and problematic juxtaposition between two different layers of rock. But it's also a metaphor, right? It's a really exciting idea, and that's what I mean. It's as you just said, it's a clean cut. It's something that you can observe. You can, it's the width of a hand, right? And so you can actually stand at that juncture and contemplate, um, deep time and profound geologic change, and I find it a really fascinating uh, juncture that opens the doorway to a whole set of ideas that are super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I wanted to talk a little bit, since we've covered the Emerald Mile, which everyone should read because it's a history book, it's an adventure story, it's an homage to this massive industrial project of the Glen Canyon Dam, the people who fix it. But then you take on this other project, which seems insane on its face, which is that you're going to walk through the Grand Canyon and not the conventional path of the rim to rim that people do, which is that you start either in the North Rim or the South Rim, you go down to the Phantom Ranch where the Colorado is, and then from Phantom Ranch you go back up to whichever way you're going. So you cross all of these geologic layers, but it's a really well-trammeled path. There's mule trains that are going down there, there's campsites, there's ranger stations. At Phantom Ranch, there's actually a concession stand where you can buy lemonade and Skittles, hot dogs. It's a really weird carnival-y place that's always full of hikers. I lead these, once a year we go do a rim to rim to rim to raise money for multiple
Wow,
sclerosis
okay.
research and cancer research.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so I've been down there a couple of times, and it's just really funny every time that you show up because it's just, 50 people just lying on the ground drinking lemonade and
Yeah.
that are then going to go. But you and your friend Peter McBride decide that you're going to actually walk the length of the canyon, which is which turns out to be much harder than you anticipated.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, I mean, I think this might be a moment to just elaborate for a second. I mean the Grand Canyon. So it's this giant chasm that's the Colorado River has cut across the face of the landscape of northern Arizona. And one way of thinking about it, if you look at it on a map, is it's just a long and really loopy. It's almost like a W. It's like a giant W in the crudest possible terms. The river flows from north to south. It makes this giant bend, and then kind of goes north again, and it kind of goes south again. But it's trending generally from east to west. And the river, as it makes that journey from the beginning of the canyon at a place called Lee's Ferry to a geologic formation known as the Grand Wash Cliffs, which is the western terminus of the canyon. It covers 277 miles. That's the length of the canyon, but the width is it's pretty narrow. If you want to cross the canyon from the south rim to the north rim or in the opposite direction, as you just said, you can take a bunch of different trails, but it's only about 15 to 20 miles. So it's much longer than it is wide. And which is a kind of a preface to the kind of question you just implicitly asked, which is, well, how did I get into this mess? One thing that happened to me is that, just to go back to a moment for the Emerald Mile, when I finished writing the Emerald Mile, I think I said, I kind of said this directly at the beginning part of our conversation. I kind of thought I was done. I was certainly done with the book. And the book itself taught me that wasn't the case. And the book became the locomotive, and it started pulling me in all these different directions. Well, there's something else that I had to learn as well. I thought that I was done with Grand Canyon. And I thought that as a writer, what I was going to have to do was go find another project and move on to the next thing. And it just turned out that the canyon wasn't done with me. And that message was delivered to me by a friend of mine, a professional collaborator, but also a friend, a guy by the name of Peter McBride, who's a National Geographic photographer and filmmaker. And like me, Pete had quite a bit of experience on the Colorado River. And he and I have a history of working together. It goes back almost 20 years on a whole series of magazine assignments that have taken us all over the world. And we partnered up, and each of these assignments, the characteristic that they all share is that partly because we're just very, very busy, and partly because it's hard to make a living as a freelance magazine person, and you're always kind of trying to finish one project while you're planning the next. Each of these assignments was characterized by like incredibly poor preparation and inadequate homework on our part. And so each assignment kind of was a disaster. Things just went wrong on all of them. And but Pete has a history of kind of talking me into these projects, despite me knowing that things will probably go horribly wrong, and me saying yes. And so a year after the Emerald Mile came out, Pete approached me and said, "I've got a fabulous new idea." And the essence of this idea is that you think you know the world of the Grand Canyon because you know the river, but what we're going to do is we're going to put 55-pound packs on our backs, and we're going to hike the length of Grand Canyon. We're not going to hike across it. We're going to hike along it, and we're going to do this despite the fact that there's no trail. And when he put that idea to me, he knew that there was a component to it that I would find irresistible, even though I had suspicions that this would not be a good thing, because hiking is very different from boating. Um, but part of the Emerald Mile, the main character in the Emerald Mile, is a river guide by the name of Kenton Grua, whose idea it was to set a speed record by riding a small wooden dory on the crest of this giant flood that descended on the Colorado River in the spring of 1983. But several years prior to that, he had done something that arguably was much more impressive and was by far the greater accomplishment. Um, and in a nutshell, what it involved was that he became the first person in modern recorded history. That's an important distinction to make. First person in modern recorded history to figure out how to walk from one end of Grand Canyon National Park to the other. And it says something, I think, about the brokenness and the shattered and fragmented nature of the topography inside the canyon that the first modern recorded journey that we have, exploratory trip through Grand Canyon by white Europeans, took place in the summer of 1869. And Kenton Grua didn't figure out how to walk through the thing until the spring of 1977. So there's 106, 107 years between going through it by boat and walking through it. And the Emerald Mile, among many other things, was a exploration of Kenton Grua's personality as a river guide. Well, what Pete understood was that what I would find irresistible was the opportunity to explore the other part of this fascinating and complicated and difficult man by following literally in his footsteps through the other part of his exploration of the canyon. And that's largely the reason that I said yes and agreed to it. And everything that followed from it, pretty much from the first step that we took along this non-trail in September of 2015, was pretty much the biggest disaster that we had ever experienced as journalists. I mean, it was just the train went off the rails from the very beginning.
I mean, certainly probably the longest continuous disaster. Because it took you more than a year to finish, right?
So the journey required, there's two ways to hike the length of the Grand Canyon: a continuous transect where you begin and don't stop until you get to the end, or a sectional transect where you break up that journey into segments. And by the way, I said a moment ago that the Colorado River, it takes 277 miles to get from one end to the other. If you're moving through the canyon on foot, you will be forced to move into and back out of so many tributary canyons, and you'll spend so much time moving up and down the walls to piece together a route along what are often very thin ledges and terraces that you will cover somewhere between 650 and 750 miles. That's how convoluted it is. So yes, we and I forgot the trajectory of where we were going with this. Please remind me.
I mean, it's such a fascinating story for me because I really love the idea of going to a place where there is no trail. It's kind of romantic, the idea that you would be able to strike out and cross a landscape, and then every time I do it, I'm confronted by the unbelievable harshness of
Oh my
even
God.
the
Yeah.
nicest landscape.
Oh my God. I mean, that is so true. And that is the very reason why it took so long. We did this sectional traverse. It took 8 back-to-back expeditions. And each expedition, at the end of each of those, we would climb out of the canyon, come back to Flagstaff, rest, reprovision, sometimes wait for a couple of months, particularly in the summer, and then come back in at the place we left off and string those sections together like you would beads on a necklace. And so the whole thing took about 750 miles, and the arc of the whole journey was 14 months. And you are so right. I didn't really think about this very much before. The idea of like striking off on your own across a landscape and making your own trail and deciding where you want to go is just really romantic. It's a lovely idea. And the moment that you begin to move from the idea to the actual thing itself, you just realize how wonderful trails are. Not just because they enable you to follow a path, and that not following a path is incredibly difficult, like and unpleasant, but also because trails offer things that all of us crave, whether we realize it or not. They offer a promise that if you start out here, it will take you somewhere that you want to be and maybe need to be. And it will guide you along a landscape that's sometimes very complicated. And at any point along that trail, if you have questions about where you are or whether you are headed towards where you need to be and want to be, the trail promises you that you're going to be okay. And the moment you step off of the trail, all that gets thrown out the window. And that's to say nothing of just the sheer brutality of just having to think about where to place your foot each and every moment and to navigate across, in the case of the Grand Canyon, a vertical wilderness, right? A desert that is tipped, whose axis is tipped from the horizontal to the vertical. And then to be, in the case of Grand Canyon again, to be moving through the desert, a vertical desert wilderness, carrying a tremendous amount of weight on your back, and hiking across a set of ledges that are often 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 feet above the Colorado River, which means that you are in view of the greatest river in the American Southwest, but unable to access it because you cannot scale the cliffs that separate you from it. And so your life depends, you can very easily die within view of this enormous waterway, and your life depends on puddles of water, what we call potholes, depressions in the slick rock that accumulate an inch or two of snowmelt or rainfall with each and every passing storm, and that are ephemeral. They will evaporate within the space of a few days. And you hopscotch from one to the next, adhering to a mandate that's often repeated by long distance desert backpackers, which is that you are never moving towards water. You are always moving away from water. And what that means is that if you move so far beyond your last known source of water without finding the next source of water and are unable to get back, you will die within 48 to 72 hours, depending on the conditions. And all of that, while not having a trail to point the way, it just makes it a very different endeavor. And neither Pete nor I had any conception of how hard it was, how challenging it was, and how inadequate our knowledge of, like, the one part of this landscape that we thought we knew. Like, I'd written a giant 430-page book that was like a love letter from me to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, to the world of whitewater and wooden boats and the people who are obsessed with that. that in no way meant that I was an expert in or prepared to enter and move through the world, the kingdom of rock that presides above the world of the river at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Nor did I appreciate that the world that I knew and considered myself an expert on is less than 1% of this 2 million acre landscape. The rest of it is cliffs and ledges and rock. And Pete and I somewhat blithely figured, how hard could it actually be? We thought that it was going to take about 2 months for us to, move from one end to the other. We knew that there were going to be some challenges, but we figured we would do what we always did. We would just sort of bumble our way through it. We'd learn as we went. We would just kind of figure it out. And in the end, everything would be okay. And like, that was just not the case. It was so not the case.
Well, what's really interesting is that you find this group of people that are as devoted to the rock world of the canyon as the group of people that are devoted to the water world of the Grand Canyon. And they're the ones that end up shepherding you through this entire journey, and they help you prepare for it. And so the book starts with you going out with a group that had intended to do this basically speed run of the canyon, like they were going to walk it as fast as humanly possible. You guys are completely unprepared, carrying too much gear. Pete nearly dies from severe dehydration at some point. You guys get rescued, and there's this passage where you talk about, what the effects of it are had you not been rescued, where somebody who's so severely dehydrated that their electrolytes are imbalanced, if they don't get to a hospital and get an IV, their brain just shuts down. And so, by the grace of God, you guys are rescued, and you end up going back into the canyon after this. And right on the eve, as you're preparing to go by yourselves, you have people that come that are saying, no, there's no way that you guys are going out by yourselves. We're going to help you through this.
Yeah, and the sequence was slightly different. I mean, we were rescued. We returned to Flagstaff with our tails between our legs, acknowledging that we had failed. We were trying to figure out which of us was going to call up our editors at National Geographic. This, by the way, was an assignment for National Geographic magazine. So which of us was going to be the one to make the call to National Geographic headquarters in Washington, DC, and explain that, we had fallen on our faces, and that if they wanted this project completed, they were going to have to outsource it to somebody else. And it was then that a group of people who are incredibly passionate about the canyon, this group that you were talking about, that, word reached them that these two clueless journalists were about to abandon their National Geographic project, which, by the way, was designed, the purpose of the story was, it was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. Right, the National Park Service was going to be celebrating its centenary in the summer of 2016. And National Geographic wanted to acknowledge this by having a pair of journalists walk from one end of the most iconic national park in the system to the other and take a kind of an informal inventory of the secret treasures and wonders that reside inside of that landscape that are invisible from the rim, which is where most of the 6 million people who visit Grand Canyon each and every year see the canyon from, or from the river, where a much smaller subset, 26,000, float down the river on commercial or private river expeditions. And in the course of taking that informal inventory, those two journalists would also do something else. They would be able to write about the threats that loom over this landscape and this park. Threats in the forms of various different projects, tourism projects, mining projects, etc., that threaten the integrity of the land and the park itself. And the people in Flagstaff who came to adopt us did so partly because they are kind and generous people, partly because they belong to a subculture very much like the river culture that believes in generosity and karma. And by the way, there's quite a bit of interflow between these two subcultures. But they also helped us, in fact, mainly helped us because they are passionate about this park and this canyon, and they wanted some exposure and some publicity for the threats that loom over the landscape. And for that reason, they, you know, they called a meeting. They invited us over to one of their houses. They explained to us that they were going to put us through a kind of like hiking makeover program, extreme hiking makeover program. They were going to redo our nutrition and our menus. They were going to redo our maps. Our packs were going to be reevaluated. The weight we carried would be radically altered. And then that they would appoint members of themselves as like minders and babysitters who would go back into the canyon with us and kind of pull us through the canyon like a locomotive pulls a caboose, to use an analogy I used earlier in this conversation. And that was really the reason why we went back. We didn't decide to go back and then get adopted by these people. They adopted us and told us that we were going to go back with them and put us in the position where we basically could not say no, or to say no would have been somehow fundamentally wrong. And they are the reason why we were able to return to the canyon and ultimately complete the journey. And in so doing, they changed the nature of the journey itself. They changed it from a kind of like, as Pete and I saw it, a kind of like heroic endeavor undertaken by two friends who went into the place alone and figured it out. And instead it became a communal project between a group of people, all of whom had profound feelings about the landscape itself, who had different layers of expertise and different things to bring to the project. And by the way, we had something really important that none of them had. And that's why they wanted to bring us through. I mean, they were expert backpackers, climbers. They had enormous skill sets in terms of like land navigation. They had tremendous physical prowess in terms of strength and endurance. But what none of them were professional storytellers. To get back to a theme that we've talked about a lot already. They could move through the canyon, but they could not tell its story in a way that would be compelling for a larger audience. They understood that that was the one thing that we had that they didn't. And storytellers whose skill sets blend, who complement each other, right? One of us is visual, the other works in language. And so this project became, as I said, a communal project undertaken by a group of people. And that taught me something important, or it opened my mind to something very salient about not just this national park, but I think all of our national parks and all of our public lands. I'm going to try and be concise about this, but I'll start by saying, if you're an American and you care about wilderness and nature and are interested in moving into it and through it and learning from it and being transformed by it, you are part of a culture that encourages the framing of that project in solitary terms. If you read Henry David Thoreau, if you read Edward Abbey, if you read, many, if not all, of the great writers of wilderness, you are encouraged to think about the endeavor of moving through wilderness as something that you do alone. And by virtue of being alone, you experience certain lessons and insights that you could get in no other way. And our experience in Grand Canyon taught me that, that's not the only way to do it. And it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And the doing it in a communal manner, it actually speaks to and dovetails with the fact that many of us like to think about nature as a solitary experience, but to the extent that we as citizens experience it, particularly in our national parks, almost none of us experience it in a solitary manner. How do we go to our national parks? What do? We go as families. if you have experience in a national park, there's a good chance that you were first given a taste of it because your parents took you there. Um, and as a young person, you were exposed to it for the very first time, and then maybe you went back as an older person. And if you had either of those experiences, there's a good chance that you will want to take your kids there as well. What we do is we think of these places as places whose insights and value resides in solitude, but whose but the most common way that we actually interact with them is with people we love. And what these spaces do by affording the opportunity to move through them with people that you care about and people that you love, whether they're friends or family or kids or grandparents or partners and spouses, they almost always, not always, but almost always end up strengthening the bonds that already exist between us. That is one of the most important and valuable aspects to our public lands and our national parks. And it is something that I don't think is very well understood or articulated or acknowledged. And so
Well, there's almost
this
nothing in
experience,
modern society that would catalyze or cram you together in a way that you can't individually be pulled off into your various worlds, right? Your worlds of individual stories and the internet and your daily grind and all the things that would separate you. But something about being out in the middle of nowhere with friends and loved ones where that's all you have is each other, really. I mean, of course you have the wilderness itself, but you're really forced together and to interact on this long-term basis over hours, if not days, with only each other and in no input from anybody else. It's really, really unique.
But I would even go one level deeper, which is that I don't think that indigenous societies spent a lot of time on the landscape where there's just one person wandering out into the bush to maybe never be heard from again or to maybe come back. Like, it's always this group project of going out into the woods that the existence of a trail can let you forget because, well, you're on the trail, you're alone, you're enjoying the solitude, but that's kind of the same event stretched out over time because somebody has come through and they have built the trail and the people that have walked it have maintained the trail and there's groups that come in and get the deadfall out. And so really, even if you're not there with a person when you're on a trail, that's the thing that I'm always contemplating, like a guide on the PCT. And it's just extraordinary. The hobbyists, volunteers come through and they cut down, they clear the fallen trees and maintain the trail, maintain the tread. And it's never.
It's wild being like 10 miles into a trail and seeing a chainsaw tree across the.
Yeah, like somebody hiked in with like a 30-pound chainsaw in addition to all of their stuff in order to be able to make this something that's passable.
yeah, I mean, 100%. A trail is an affirmation of our communal experience in nature, and you're right that things happen between us when uh, we move into wilderness. When we move into wilderness and are forced to focus on each other in a way that is not normally possible, in what those of us who love the Grand Canyon call the world beyond the rims. But that's changing. It's important to acknowledge that that is now changing. I mean, it is now possible to move into wilderness and be entirely connected to the world. There are river companies that offer outfitted trips at the bottom of the Grand Canyon that have Starlink communication set up each night in camp where you can log on to the internet, you can read the New York Times, you can check your stock portfolio, you
I
can
cannot tell you how much I hate that.
respond to text messages.
Deepest part of my, because for me it's like when it was on the PCT, there's a section that we used to do where you were in reception the entire time, and it is not the same experience as a section where you are completely cut off.
It's not, and I think that advance in technology represents an erosion of the quality of an experience that many of us crave without even being aware of it. one of the things that Pete and I experienced, we didn't really start to become aware of it until we were deep into the trip, maybe halfway into the trip. And perhaps the reason for that is that it was only then that we began to experience a level of fitness and like something approaching competency, that we each and every day wasn't just a giant sufferfest. And we began to we were able to take stock of our surroundings in a way that wasn't possible at the beginning when we were just in so much pain. But one of the things that struck us most deeply was it was at odds with how we thought of the canyon. Both of us, but Pete in particular, because he was a photographer. We thought of the canyon as a place whose greatest treasures were visual. We thought of the canyon as a place where, like, if you wanted to explain to others like why it's so amazing, you would talk about like the color of the light, or the color of the different layers of rock, or the texture of those rock, or the profile that they inscribe. You talk about the complexity of the canyon's architecture, and when you do all of those things, you are reaching into the toolbox of the vocabulary of the eye, talking about things we can see. But the longer Pete and I spent inside the canyon, the more we became aware of the silence and the stillness inside the canyon. It's never completely silent, or rarely completely silent. There are always natural sounds. You can hear the wind, you can hear the sound that your feet make as you move across different types of rock. You can identify different types of rock by the sound that your feet make on them. But there is an absence of human sound and human noise that that provides a different context for those natural sounds. And there is, unless a storm is moving through, a stillness, a dearth of movement that is almost disquieting, but with time becomes deeply comforting. And so the longer we spent in there, the more Pete and I became convinced that, like, one of the greatest treasures inside this landscape is not visual, it's auditory. It's this crystalline silence that you're bathed in. And it's what happens to you when you spend enough time being steeped by it, because it almost has the ability to open up a space inside of you, like a kind of a miniature Grand Canyon in you, into which the things that are made possible by silence take place. The opportunity for contemplation, meditation, reflection, and a sense of tranquility that comes with those things. And all of that stands in incredibly stark contrast with the noise that we make everywhere else in the world beyond the rims. And so this is an aspect of the land that was shown to us with time. This is another important part of it. It's like, these are places, these natural places, wilderness, complex wilderness, places like Grand Canyon, national parks like Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Great Smoky Mountains, where there's an almost direct proportion between the amount of time you spend in them and what they offer you. These are places where there is something to be gained, not by thinking of them as quick hit vacations that you dip into over the course of like a weekend, in the process of like hitting a whole bunch of other national parks and doing all of them. The more time you spend in just one of them, the better the chances are that it will not just hand you a bunch of things that you might not have had the opportunity to get otherwise, but it will change you on a level that will affect the person that you become when you move beyond them and return to the world in which all of us live. And that is at odds with, that is as much at odds with how we are encouraged to consume these places or experience these places by the culture that we live in. It's as much as at odds with it as having access to your Facebook comments page is inside of a place like Grand Canyon.
Beautifully said.
And I think for most people, just the idea of taking months to enjoy something, whatever it is completely off the table.
But I mean, I lead these trips that are 4 days, and even in those 4 days, I think it's transformative for people because it's this rhythm of you wait.
I mean, geez, one day a week, even for me, is incredible.
Yeah, I mean,
Of
it
being
just
completely cut off from everything else.
yeah, it narrows your focus. You wake up, you eat, you walk, you sleep.
Right.
You wake up,
Right.
you eat, you walk, you sleep. There's something very timeless and beautiful about that. But look, we gotta let you go.
I'm really sorry I have to jump.
No,
all good.
I could talk to you for days. I love this stuff. I'm so grateful for you taking the time. I know that it's a longer format than you usually have time for, so thank you so much.
No, it's a privilege and a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed speaking to both of you. And I wish you all good things and only good things in your own projects moving forward. So-
Real quick before you go, are you
Yeah.
working on something new that you want to that you can talk about? Or
You know, I in some ways I wish I had an answer, and in other ways I'm glad I don't. I mean, this project, it took a year to do and 7 years to write. There's not been a Christmas or a kid's birthday or a holiday in almost the last decade where I have not pulled myself away from the people I love to, you know, work on some book related deadline. And I don't know if this applies to music or science, but it certainly does to book writing, that like the act of creating intimacy on the page involves stealing that intimacy from the people you are most close to. And what I most look forward to, and also have a duty to perform right now that this book is finally done, is to return to that intimacy, and to not work and to not write and to not jump into another project that has deadlines attached and a marketing plan at the end of it, and it involves editors with questions. And there may never be another one like that. I'm 59 years old. I don't know if I have another book in me, but if I do, I hope that the start of that project is months, if not years away, because I have things to do with people I care about
It's beautiful.
right now.
I love that. That's a beautiful place to stop.
Okay.
Thank you for giving us your little crumbs of wisdom here, and it's been really fun to chat with you.
Absolutely. Likewise.
And good
You guys
luck.
take good
luck
care.
with the onslaught. Enjoy it.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
You guys take good care and be well.
You
Okay.
as well. Bye.
Okay. Bye bye.